The Mafia boss's girlfriend illegalities launched hidden cameras in his penthouse and accidentally caught the ultimate betrayal. She watched the secret monitors, desperately waiting for him to slip up, only to witness the untouchable kingpin looking at a lowly housekeeper with pure, unguarded obsession. Enraged and jealous, she hired a heavily in-depth hitman to terrorize the Maid, triggering a brutal chain of events that ended in absolute, terrifying bloodshed. You and I step into the clinical observation room together to examine the case of Dominic Vasari. On the streets, he operates as a classic megalomaniac narcissist, architecting violence with terrifying precision. Yet here he is, reduced to his knees on a Persian rug. He begs his 6-year-old son, Leo, for eye contact. The child is locked in a severe sensory overload, screaming silently while clutching his ears. Outside, a siren wails. It is a textbook reminder that the most destructive psychological warfare occurs not in the streets, but within our own minds. Dominic has exhausted $2 million on top psychiatrists, yielding 0 results. His hardened sociopathic enforcers stand paralyzed. Control is an absolute illusion, a vital lesson we must all eventually face. Exact epicenter of this psychological collapse, a housekeeper wheels her cart past the door. She bypasses verbal processing entirely. Instead, she employs a simple tactile intervention, manipulating a white washcloth into a rabbit. The autonomic arousal in the boy immediately drops, his thrashing ceases. It is a profound clinical truth and a crucial life lesson. Genuine human connection regulates the nervous system far more effectively than any financial resource. She deposits the object and retreats, lowering her threat posture. Slowly, Leo crawls forward. He initiates contact with the soft fabric, displaying a positive facial affect. Dominic freezes, paralyzed by the narcissistic terror that he might fracture this fragile behavioral breakthrough. Dominic experiences acute cognitive dissonance. His voice fractures as he demands her identity. The subject smooths her apron and minimizes her presence, claiming she is a nobody before exiting. Savannah makes $14.50 an hour, a stark contrast to his wealth, yet she becomes his ultimate psychological fixation. It serves as a haunting life lesson. The most profound shifts in our trajectory often come from those society renders invisible. This precise behavioral anomaly ignited a turf war and forged the foundational seeds of what we classically identify as Stockholm Syndrome. Now he sits on the 47th floor. He endlessly replays the security footage of the rabbit, entirely consumed by the fixation. 4 guards stand by in heavy silence. I must analyze the foundational pathology of his empire. His secretary deposits a dossier and retreats like prey avoiding a predator. The Vasari syndicate dominates the city, while his father trafficked narcotics. Dominic restructured the operation to eliminate that sector. This illustrates a powerful behavioral lesson. We are never strictly determined by our genetic predispositions. We possess the cognitive agency to break toxic family cycles. However, this moral pivoting could not protect his wife. 2 years prior, Elena absorbed a ballistic impact intended for the narcissist. She bled out, shielding Leo. That catastrophic optical and emotional trauma instantly induced psychogenic mutism in the child, severing his vocal responses. Frankie Duca, a sociopathic enforcer conditioned over 22 years, enters. He confirms the Maid has no criminal profile, but the megalomaniac narcissist requires absolute analytical control. How did an uneducated subject succeed where 7 licensed clinicians failed? The file reveals Savannah is 27. A younger sibling drowned in 2014, a guardian deceased last year. Dominic instantly identifies the parallel neuropathology, confirming the deceased brother was on the autism spectrum. He approaches the glass, surveying the Manhattan grid. It presents a cold, clinical lesson for us. All you can hoard infinite capital and dominate thousands of lives. But power cannot synthesize the neurological peace your fractured mind demands. Dominic deploys classic coercive control. He instructs Frankie to extract her the following day, weaponizing her economic vulnerability by threatening her employment, to clinically deconstruct her extreme empathy. We must examine an origin point 19 years prior in Ohio. Savannah was 8, maternal abandonment, paternal exploitation. She was left in a resources-scarce environment with a nonverbal sibling, Thomas. The psychological lesson here is deeply resilient extreme early life adversity, while traumatizing, frequently cultivates hypervigilant emotional intelligence. Savannah was forced into parentification, systematically suppressing her own developmental needs to stabilize her incredibly fragile domestic reality. The subject, Thomas, exhibited severe sensory processing deficits. He rejected fluorescent lighting and specific textile textures. Clinicians labeled it autism, but it was his grandmother who provided the vital behavioral framework. She instructed Savannah to bypass ocular contact and monitor his hands. Let you and I hold on to this profound analytical lesson. If you want to decode human motivation, ignore the verbal deception and observe the micro-expressions of the body. Actions do not lie. Savannah heavily adapted her behavioral outputs to match his needs. She engineered the washcloth rabbit as a transitional object for sleep and substituted humming for speech, manufacturing an auditory safe zone to prevent neurological overload. We now isolate the specific traumatic rupture. Savannah is supervising Thomas at an aquatic facility. She breaks visual contact for exactly 240 seconds to procure a stimulus. In that microscopic window, he aspirates water and expires. The acute trauma response triggers temporary mutism and complete social withdrawal. Decades later, her guardian perishes, issuing a final therapeutic directive. Do not let this survivor guilt permanently sever your capacity for maternal attachment. Savannah relocates to New York, carrying a biological artifact of his hair in the hotel utility closet. She experiences a severe panic episode. The lesson is critical. Rumination on microfailures will permanently anchor you to your trauma. Her somatic tremors are a direct result of recognizing Leo's dissociation. It perfectly mirrored her deceased brother's facial effect. She verbally processes her guilt, promising the auditory hallucination of her brother that she will not avoid the stimulus this time. A colleague interrupts, inducing a heightened startle response. Savannah attempts avoidance by offering resignation, but the colleague reveals the apex predator has identified her. By 9 the next morning, she is escorted through security protocols into the megalomaniac narcissist's territory. Instantly, her hypervigilance kicks in. She scans his hands, noting an obsolete wedding band. Remember this life lesson: aggressively confronting your phobias is the primary mechanism to neutralize them. The spatial tension is palpable. Dominic exhibits extensive epidermal callousing on his metacarpals, indicating extreme latinite physical aggression. As a coping mechanism, he demands her methodology. She employs minimization, stating it was merely a folded textile. The narcissist instantly shatters her defense mechanism, weaponizing her deceased brother's identity. He drops his physical elevation to match hers and introduces an overwhelming financial incentive, $2,000 weekly, to act as a therapeutic companion. Savannah attempts a logical retreat, citing her lack of academic credentials. But the clinical lesson stands clear: authentic therapeutic value is never generated by a diploma, but by the raw capacity for empathetic mirroring. Nick aggressively neutralizes her logistical resistance. He notes the failure of 7 certified clinicians. Savannah then establishes a highly dangerous boundary. She rejects the financial compensation, explicitly acknowledging his criminal pathology. The enforcer ceases respiration, denying a megalomaniac narcissist is statistically lethal. Dominic invades her proximity, probing for fear. Her response is exceptionally detached. She states her amygdala only registers threats from the unknown, and he is a known variable. Let you and I recognize the vital lesson: maintaining rigid, psychological boundaries is the only way to command respect from a predator for the first time. His pathological grief is entirely overridden by intense clinical fascination. We conclude this session by observing her in her secure environment. The structural vibrations of the passing transit do not register, as sensory habituation has occurred. She extracts a metallic container, holding her traumatic anchors: a degraded photograph, the original fabric rabbit, and a hospital identifier. She mentally regresses to their final evening. The subject, Thomas, had employed tactile communication, tracing a rabbit into her palm. He bypassed ocular contact entirely, yet successfully transmitted absolute attachment. It forces us to confront a profound psychological lesson. Love does not require aggressive verbalization or grandiose displays. Frequently, the most microscopic behavioral inputs carry the heaviest emotional significance. Let us open this psychological file together. In the suffocating darkness of her bedroom, Savannah experiences a complete emotional decompensation. The psychological dam finally shatters, and she collapses as profound grief manifests in raw, agonizing sobs. Her phone vibrates, rupturing the isolation. It is Miss Maggie, demanding the unvarnished truth. Savannah clinically confesses the reality of the criminal kingpin and his impossible offer. Maggie recalibrates the moral framework. Dominic may be an apex predator, but his son is an innocent variable. If Savannah had not lost her own boy, would she not beg a stranger to intervene? It illustrates a fundamental behavioral truth. We must never project the profound pathology of a father onto a defenseless child. True compassion requires stepping directly into the darkest environments to rescue the vulnerable. He establishes a rigid behavioral protocol. The moment Savannah senses a threat, she must initiate contact. At 7:15 precisely, Savannah dials Frankie, the syndicate enforcer, displaying remarkable autonomic control. Her voice never wavers as she establishes 3 strict boundaries. First, she retains her civilian employment. Second, she requires exactly $600 a week in documented funds, effectively sterilizing the money. Frankie experiences acute cognitive dissonance, completely disarmed. Her final condition is the ultimate metric. If the traumatized boy exhibits a single spike of fear, she terminates the arrangement. Savannah is the first subject to ever negotiate a criminal contract downward. It demonstrates a core psychological reality. An unyielding personal integrity provides the absolute strongest mental armor when navigating a deeply corrupted world. Step into the observation room with me to analyze this behavioral shift. Frankie watches his sociopathic employer exhibit a rare micro-expression of relief, a faint smile, his first positive affect in 2 years. Dominic terminates the call, securing Savannah for Monday. But the stability crumbles as the heavy door opens. Camila enters, a parasitic personality clinging to an apex predator. She presents a fabricated smile and luxury pastries for a severely traumatized child. She mimics the immaculate trophy partner, yet her clinical lack of empathy bleeds through her dead, flat gaze. Subjects can mask their disorders in fine materials, but a malignant core always exposes itself. This provides a necessary human lesson. Genuine beauty is measured entirely by how carefully you handle a shattered psyche, never by the shallow luxuries you present to the world. Notice how Camila utilizes classic psychological avoidance, actively ignoring the residual trauma in the space. She never acknowledges Alina, the primary attachment figure Dominic buried. She attempts physical reinforcement, kissing his jaw while inquiring if the damaged child will consume her pastries. Dominic dissociates completely, his mind anchored to a sensory memory of a quiet woman simply folding a towel. Soon after, Camila's narcissistic mask fractures on the street. She aggressively messages a hidden contact, complaining the kingpin refuses intimacy. The return text demands absolute behavioral compliance. Concurrently, Savannah sits in silence, gently tracing a faded photograph. It highlights a profound human truth. Authentic love requires carrying the heaviest grief, performing quiet, unselfish acts to honor the vital attachments we have lost. Savannah remains oblivious that floors below. This malignant narcissist is hastily destroying digital evidence. When Monday initiates, Savannah exits the elevator completely devoid of status symbols. She carries a canvas bag containing simple tactile stimulants, washcloths, origami paper, and basic kinetic slime. Frankie escorts her to a highly secure door, delivering a clinical warning. The juvenile subject has been in a state of hyperarousal since 6 a.m, rejecting food, while the volatile kingpin monitors the zone. Savannah exhibits no startle response. She maintains a perfectly regulated nervous system. Offering a steady nod to the danger, it validates a critical human truth. True power does not rely on accumulated capital or physical threat displays. The most effective instrument to stabilize a fractured psyche is an unconditionally stable, empathetic presence. The door opens to reveal a textbook physical manifestation of severe, complicated grief. The environment is aggressively sterile, a sensory deprivation chamber of blinding white linens, devoid of developmental stimuli. It is an isolation unit constructed by a megalomaniac terrified of his own emotional dysregulation. In the furthest quadrant, the tiny patient sits in a catatonic freeze response, mechanically folding a blank scrap of paper. Hovering above him like a predatory bird is Camila. Wrapped in cashmere, she projects a synthetic affectation that practically contaminates the oxygen. This diagnostic snapshot offers you and me a profound realization. Authentic psychological safety can never be procured through manipulative scripts or luxury commodities. It requires a highly regulated, deeply authentic human attachment to finally deactivate a child's profound terror. Camila elevates her vocal frequency to a histrionic register, demanding a social response from the traumatized subject. This acoustic assault triggers an immediate nervous system alarm. Little Leo exhibits a violent startle reflex, physically withdrawing into a defensive posture. This exact moment isolates Savannah's advanced clinical intuition. She categorizes Camila as a profound environmental stressor, rather than flooding the child's proximity. Savannah initiates a masterful counter-conditioning protocol. She entirely removes direct eye contact. Lowering her center of gravity to the floor 3 meters away, she extracts blue origami paper and begins a predictable motor task. It underscores a crucial therapeutic truth. Occasionally, the most effective intervention for severe panic is to offer complete sensory silence, granting a shattered nervous system the autonomy to simply breathe. I have profiled dozens of manipulators exhibiting this exact pathology. Camila reorients toward Savannah, deploying a manufactured social smile. She attempts to establish dominance by regurgitating a shallow psychological concept. Savannah completely rejects the bait. Maintaining her visual focus on the manual task, she intercepts the attack. Her tone is non-threatening but carries an immovable boundary. She clinically instructs Camila to vacate the room for 30 minutes to reduce the patient's cognitive load. The fabricated effect instantly dissolves from Camila's face. She spits a defensive rationalization while aggressively scanning Santa's low-income attire and scuffed timepiece. The hostility is palpable as she finally retreats. It leaves us with an absolute metric of human value. Authentic social grace and profound emotional intelligence share zero correlation with the retail value of a subject's wardrobe. Situational irony in this clinical setting is staggering. Savannah operates without a critical piece of historical data regarding the severe traumatic trigger present. Camila's synthetic fragrance perfectly matches the olfactory signature of the operative on duty. 2 years prior, the exact night the juvenile was exposed to extreme violence and entered selective mutism. The child's somatic memory is trapped in a perpetual loop of terror. Savannah remains blind to this conditioning, yet her maternal intuition performs flawlessly. She systematically eliminates the harsh fluorescence and manually disengages the heavy blackout barriers. She allows warm sunlight to neutralize the sterile cold of the isolation unit. It provides a foundational clinical truth, often physically dismantling environmental barriers and allowing pure light to penetrate the darkness is the primary requirement for stabilizing a traumatized consciousness. Anna recalibrates her position and engages in repetitive tactile labor. Her fingers manipulate the material with methodical precision, allowing 30 minutes to evaporate in absolute sensory silence then. The auditory cue registers the subtle friction of a fabric cushion. She exhibits masterful impulse control, maintaining her visual fixation on her hands. The highly sensitized subject initiates a deliberate proximity-seeking behavior. He halts 1 meter out, mesmerized by the predictable motor rhythm. Operating beneath his threat threshold, Savannah gently pushes the blue origami figure across the floor. He does not grab it, but crucially, the flight response is absent. Gradually, she introduces a low-frequency auditory stimulus, a deep, resonant vocal vibration that biologically downregulates a panicked amygdala. It illustrates a core behavioral axiom. Authentic psychological integration is never a high-decibel event. It is engineered in the absolute quietest, most patient fractions of human existence. Let us examine the data of this critical breakthrough. The juvenile subject adjusts his posture, permitting that biological frequency to actively recalibrate his nervous system. 60 minutes elapse before the syndicate enforcer taps on the barrier. At that precise microsecond, the psychological resistance breaks. Demonstrating significant motor tremors, Leo voluntarily breaches the negative space. He secures the paper artifact and deposits it into his pocket. Savannah displays peak clinical restraint. She refuses to flood the subject with positive reinforcement, merely delivering a calm expression of gratitude before initiating withdrawal. The child remains nonverbal, yet his gaze stays firmly locked on her departing vector. This provides a definitive human metric. Durable psychological trust is constructed in agonizing millimeters, never in rapid surges. Meanwhile, a secondary pathology is escalating. Camila has weaponized a luxury suite into a paranoid observation deck, intensely analyzing a court surveillance feed. Today, you and I are going to unpack a case file that illustrates the anatomy of control. We begin with Camila, glaring at a security monitor. She watches a paper rabbit slide into the boy's pocket, and her amygdala fires. She texts her contact to accelerate their conspiracy. Fast forward 2 weeks. Savannah, the behavioral specialist, arrives at the penthouse 4 mornings a week. Her method is pure, clinical desensitization. During their 3rd session, while folding a blue origami swan, little Leo rests his hand against hers for 3 full seconds. Savannah does not react. She understands that traumatized subjects must initiate contact to regain autonomy. The underlying lesson here is simple. Genuine devotion requires us to consistently show up, demanding absolutely nothing, until the psychological ice begins to thaw. Savannah maintains absolute baseline stillness. During their 5th clinical session, the environmental tension fractures. Little Leo retrieves a book from the shelf, its corner bearing a faded fingerprint, the ghostly trace of his murdered mother, Elena. He drops the heavy text into Savannah's lap, presenting a massive psychological test. You and I know the desperate human urge to force a breakthrough in moments like this. Instead, she suppresses her ego entirely. She simply turns the pages, regulating the room's auditory environment by softly naming the dark blues of the painted oceans. She anchors the space in pure peace. It reminds us of a vital truth. Sometimes, the most effective intervention is simply sitting in the dark with a shattered mind, asking for nothing. 40 agonizing minutes, the traumatized subject rests against her knee, his respiration remarkably shallow. By their 7th meeting, Savannah introduces kinetic sand. The tactile stimulation mesmerizes the boy. He slowly carves a massive circle, then presses a tiny one into its edge. The pathology is obvious. The large circle is his dead mother. The clinging fragment is his own fractured ego. Savannah refuses to invade his complex grief. Instead, she molds a third shape at a measured distance. It serves as a nonverbal contract, proving she will observe his trauma without dismantling his defenses. Respecting psychological boundaries can alter a human trajectory. Leo analyzes her shape in the sand. He does not integrate it, but he leaves it perfectly intact. Out in the corridor, the Mafia kingpin Dominic stands frozen like a paranoid sentinel. His enforcer observes that the boss has been paralyzed there for 60 minutes. Dominic is experiencing a rare fracture in his armor, whispering a devastating admission. For 2 years, his sheer proximity has triggered acute panic attacks in his own biological son. Inside, Savannah sits on the floorboards, emitting a low, mournful melody. Suddenly, a fragile vibration responds. The selectively mute child is humming back. Savannah locks her hands, suppressing her adrenaline, pretending the breakthrough has not just occurred. We must understand a critical lesson here. Real compassion demands that we swallow our clinical victories, hiding our joy so the vulnerable minds we protect can feel secure. The second the door engages its lock, Savannah collapses against the corridor wall. She covers her face, weeping in silence, terrified the boy might detect her emotional decompensation. That specific melody was the auditory anchor of her late brother, right before her own family system was violently destroyed. You and I have probably noticed this exact phenomenon. The individuals carrying the most profound trauma are frequently the ones distributing bandages to the rest of society. Savannah regulates her nervous system, constructs a gentle mask, and re-enters the clinical zone. By session 12, the cognitive dam shatters. The boy crosses the room and grips her hand, dragging her to observe a bird. Savannah vocalizes its name, and the silent child perfectly mirrors the mouth movement. Savannah registers a massive dopamine spike because the child exhibited verbal mimicry, yet she suppresses her facial affect. Without warning, the suite door rips open. Camila, the kingpin's dangerously unstable partner, steps forward. She projects a manufactured smile, forcing a chilled glass of juice into Savannah's hand. This highlights a fundamental law of behavioral survival. You must monitor your perimeter when a malignant personality suddenly offers a sweet concession. Fortunately, Maggie, the vigilant housekeeper, marches down the hall. She loudly announces a fabricated phone call, providing Savannah a tactical extraction. Always respect the invisible staff. They are the objective observers who map every pathological threat lurking inside the structure. As the elevator doors shut, Maggie maintains a rigid posture, delivering a terrifying situational analysis. She whispers that Camila had been patrolling the child's room for 20 minutes, exhibiting predatory pacing. Savannah experiences physiological shock, but the older woman commands her to remain aware. Back inside the penthouse, Camille's social mask dissolves. Consumed by narcissistic rage, she dumps the liquid into an orchid. She introduced enough chemical sedatives to suppress Savannah's nervous system for days. Her clinical objective was efficient. Sever the therapeutic attachment, eliminate the specialist, and plunge the boy back into regression. True malice rarely announces itself. It quietly ferments within the vacuum of a deeply defective conscience. Camila shatters the glass against the granite, grabbing her encrypted device. Her chemical sabotage failed because of one bystander, forcing Savannah to re-enter the clinical environment the next morning. Savannah remains detached from the threat, funneling empathy strictly toward the traumatized subject. Then, an unpredictable shift occurs. Dominic, the apex predator of this syndicate, docks his vehicle hours early, He abandoned a negotiation with rival sociopaths, walking away from financial leverage and leaving his subordinates paralyzed. This forces us to confront a brutal truth. No matter the scale of your authority, reality will eventually force you to abandon your entire empire to protect the vulnerable. The syndicate leader ascends the elevator in complete isolation. Breaching the penthouse perimeter, he freezes at the visual data presented in the living room. Savannah sits barefoot on the rug, regulating the environment with kinetic sand. Pressed against her, resting his fragile weight, is little Leo. His nervous system is calm. Then the statistically impossible happens. A micro-expression of genuine joy alters the child's facial structure. He smiles. The hardened criminal experiences motor paralysis, terrified that a single exhalation might shatter this fragile reconstruction. Savannah tracks his shadow, but refuses to break the therapeutic frame. Healing is delicate, sometimes. The most courageous action a parent can take is to retreat into the shadows and allow the medicine to work. Nick initiates a microscopic head movement, silently begging the specialist not to terminate the session. The mastermind collapses into a chair, immobilized for 20 minutes. He clinically observes his damaged offspring, analyzing the woman who defibrillated the emotional dead zone of his residence. When the subject slips into sleep, Savannah applies a blanket. Only then does Dominic break his paralysis. He escorts her onto the balcony, the urban grid glowing below. Out in the cold, the most dangerous man in the city picks up a silver pot and pours her a dark roast. It is a stunning display of behavioral submission. True dominance is not physical terror. Authentic power requires the humility to serve the architect of your family's survival. She drinks the stimulant black, its bitter profile cutting the cold air. Dominic respects her refusal to soften the impact. Gripping the railing, he verbalizes his inadequacy of professional, bypass defensive walls his DNA could not penetrate. Savannah rejects his narcissistic self-pity. She explains his son monitors his heavy footfalls every night. Traumatized children are not empty vessels. They communicate on a frequency the world ignores. To validate her method, she exposes her foundational trauma, a brother violently lost, and the survivor's guilt she processes daily. The kingpin offers no platitudes, he confesses. His wife was executed 24 months ago. You and I know this cold reality. Severe grief recognizes its own reflection in the gaze of a fellow survivor. Let us examine this clinical breakthrough together. The winter wind howls around the balcony as Dominic, a man whose pathology usually demands absolute control, reveals his deepest psychological fracture. He confesses his negligence on that fatal afternoon. 2 summers ago, a rival faction ambushed their vehicle. His wife took the bullets, shielding their son, bleeding out right on top of him. Savannah processes this gruesome data and makes a brilliant psychiatric deduction. The boy is not cognitively impaired. He suffers from psychogenic mutism. The last time he vocalized, his mother was slaughtered. The human mind is remarkably brutal. It will build impenetrable psychological walls just to keep a shattered psyche breathing in the dark. Anna outlines a devastating cognitive distortion in little Leo's traumatized brain. His screams did not just accompany the shattering glass, they actively caused the murder of his primary attachment figure. Dominic freezes. His fist collides with the metal table, exposing his untreated grief. He paraded his son before 7 elite specialists, and every clinician missed this glaring trauma response. Savannah attempts to downplay her acute observation, reminding him she is merely an educator. Yet, this violent patriarch recognizes the undeniable diagnostic truth. They remain frozen on that balcony, coffee turning to ice. It proves a haunting psychological principle, often. It takes an emotionally detached stranger to diagnose the painful realities we actively repress. I are going to unpack this behavioral shift together. The heavy doors isolate Savannah, and Dominic drops his high-functioning mask. He stares into the neon city, a toxic environment that has systematically eroded his empathy, his enforcer. Frankie approaches to check his cognitive baseline. Without breaking his empty stare, Dominic poses a startling question. He wonders if a truly pure psyche can survive their corrupted ecosystem. Frankie is paralyzed. In 3 generations of observing this bloodline, no alpha figure has exhibited such catastrophic psychological doubt. From the shadows, Camila monitors this mental fracturing. The mind cannot hide its rot indefinitely. A repressed conscience will inevitably hemorrhage through even the thickest armor. Tension reaches a critical clinical threshold. Over 10 days, this apex predator abandons his ingrained behavioral loops. Instead of returning at dawn, he arrives at exactly 5. He avoids high-status social events. He conducts operations from the kitchen, his gaze fixated on the hallway. Camila descends the stairs displaying overt physical availability with 2 glasses of wine, but he offers zero neurological response. She experiences a profound narcissistic injury, driven by acute abandonment anxiety. She constructs a manipulative social trap, organizing a fake Sunday dinner to isolate Savannah. The behavioral takeaway is chillingly simple. When a known psychological aggressor suddenly mirrors the warmth of a friend, do not attempt to rationalize it. Turn around and evacuate immediately. Camila deploys superficial charm, weaponizing a sweet tone to manipulate her target into staying. But Savannah exhibits the hypervigilant threat detection of a survivor. She delivers a sterile rejection, citing a shift downstairs at 6, shutting the elevator doors on Camila's escalating hostility. 2 days later, a new stimulus is introduced. A luxury camel coat appears in the locker room, with a note claiming it no longer fit Camila. When a colleague identifies the garment as a $1,000 item, Savannah instantly recognizes the psychological snare. She buries the fabric deep in the darkest corner of her metal locker. It is a harsh, undeniable lesson in human behavior. Never accept an extravagant offering when the concealed strings are explicitly designed to suffocate you. Stick with me, this is where the pathology turns lethal. That coat was a surveillance mechanism, containing a listening device in the lining. Because Savannah quarantined it, the bug recorded nothing but the sensory deprivation of a metal locker for 9 days. Camila experiences a total loss of impulse control, escalating to a premeditated felony. She targets a hotel technician with a gambling addiction, leveraging $4,000 to route Savannah into a windowless storage room. Following the fake directive, Savannah enters the isolated space. Heavy footsteps halt behind her, and a massive physical threat blocks her only exit. It is a grim reality of human behavior. Financial leverage can fund unspeakable acts, but it can never purchase psychological peace. Savannah attempts verbal de-escalation, maintaining a calm register while stating her need to return to the lobby. The aggressor ignores the social cue, intimidating her backward into the dark storage room. She processes the terrifying sound of the deadbolt locking. Upstairs, Frankie monitors digital anomalies. He registers her card hitting the restricted basement. Triggering an immediate alarm, he contacts the Alpha. Dominic enters the elevator in 40 seconds, completely bypassing his armed entourage. He shifts into apex predator mode, stalking down the concrete corridor. With such terrifying silence, the threat never processes his approach. Remember this diagnostic standard. Authentic loyalty is never a simple verbal construct. It is an immediate, undeniable behavioral response. A single kinetic impact ruptures the silence. When Dominic weaponizes his rage, one strike is sufficient. The assailant collapses instantly. Savannah remains paralyzed against the shelving, experiencing an acute panic attack. Dominic steps over the neutralized threat, locking his dead eyes onto hers. His tone radically downshifts into a gentle register, assessing her for physical trauma. He extracts her into a heavy armored vehicle, speeding away. She hyperventilates, begging to quit. Dominic clinically agrees she is being actively hunted. We are witnessing the early stages of a trauma bond, a variation of Stockholm Syndrome. It reveals a fascinating psychological truth. Sometimes the absolute safest sanctuary is the exact dangerous environment you initially feared. Let us look at this as piece by piece. Dominic is rapidly processing the diagnostic variables. He deduces the assault was an internal operation, yet possesses absolute certainty of Savannah's innocence. She displayed zero awareness regarding the firearm beneath his desk. Her lack of trauma conditioning separates her from his associates. He transports her to Queens, his hypervigilant mind cataloging her environmental deficits. He assesses the compromised mailboxes and insufficient deadbolts she relies upon. He remains entirely nonverbal, parking in the freezing dark, maintaining observation until her window illuminates. The clinical takeaway is grounding. Sometimes the most profound demonstration of human attachment is silently ensuring a vulnerable subject reaches their sanctuary. Operating from the dark, Dominic issues a strict directive. He mandates a twofold increase in Savannah's security, stipulating they remain undetectable. He then initiates a severe purge of his organization, isolating Camila as the primary suspect. Frankie experiences cognitive dissonance, but Dominic accurately diagnoses the malignant pathology of Camila's jealousy. Meanwhile, isolated, in her penthouse, Camila is deteriorating rapidly, following hours of perceived abandonment. The boss has severed all communication. Consumed by unregulated narcissistic rage, she shatters a crystal glass against the fireplace, a physical manifestation of her fractured ego. It is a harsh psychological reality. You cannot coerce another human being into valuing you, regardless of the elaborate illusions you construct. You and I must analyze what her refusal truly means. Dominic waits in the break room, presenting a documented solution. He offers her a high-security residence in Brooklyn. Savannah immediately identifies the psychological trap. She pushes the document back, overtly rejecting the most lethal variable in her environment. She articulates that accepting such resources crosses an irreversible behavioral boundary. She refuses to be reduced to a dependent subject within a gilded cage. Dominic does not exhibit hostility. He anticipated exactly this level of rigid self-preservation. He merely nods, registering clinical approval, and requests she tolerate his invisible surveillance instead. Internalize this psychological absolute. Never forfeit your autonomy for a temporary illusion of security. Anna consents to the covert surveillance. By week 4, the traumatized child exhibits a profound neurobiological breakthrough. Leo reaches for a notepad, selecting a blue crayon acquired from her bag weeks prior. He documents his fragmented family system, a large male figure, a blonde female figure, a miniature representation of himself. It is a clinical documentation of grief. Then a heavy psychological silence occupies the room. In the negative space beside his avatar, the mute patient begins to illustrate a fourth entity. Savannah observes this, her respiration stalling. The developmental lesson is beautifully clear. True familial attachment is rarely dictated by strict genetics. It is forged by the rare individuals who remain present in the dark. Let us examine this file together. The dim light exposes the child's crinkled drawing. Notice the spatial orientation. The brown-haired woman is not beside the authoritarian father, but anchored firmly to the boy. Savannah processes this wax rendering, a pure manifestation of his isolated psyche. He is not attempting to replace his maternal ghost. He only decraves a secure attachment. The lesson here is fundamental. You never have to erase someone's traumatic history to become a stabilizing force in their life. Days later, a behavioral shift occurs. Savannah unearths a clay flute dormant for 11 years and exhales 3 hollow notes. The boy exhibits an acute freeze response, his nervous system completely suspended, before he slowly gravitates toward the acoustic stimulus. Leo, a fragile subject trapped in selective mutism, shuffles forward to press his trembling frame against Savannah. He exhibits fascinating, sensory-seeking behavior. Rather than snatching the instrument, he flattens his palm against it, absorbing the auditory vibrations directly into his nervous system. Then, a clinical breakthrough occurs. A soft hum escapes his vocal cords, mirroring her pitching. Down the corridor, his father, a documented megalomaniac, experiences acute emotional paralysis. This ruthless enforcer grips the wood until his circulation stops, entirely shattered by the auditory evidence of his son healing. The psychological lesson is clear. Unconditional positive regard will dismantle the deep mental barriers that raw, violent dominance could never even hope to breach. Savannah is washing glasses in the penthouse when Dominic materializes from the shadows. He presents as a hollow entity, heavily burdened by his violent lifestyle. He shatters the silence, disclosing that today marks his late wife's 39th birthday. He clinically details the homicidal vengeance he enacted, directly testing Savannah's flight response. Instead of exhibiting panic, she calmly dries her hands, employing a flawless de-escalation tactic. She notes that traumatic grief manufactures monstrous behavior, but a singular tether to reality can initiate recovery. The clinical lesson here remains steady. We cannot condemn the maladaptive coping mechanisms born from blinding psychological trauma, provided the subject eventually chooses stabilization over absolute destruction. Nick drops his narcissistic defenses, burdened by a 2-year dissociative fugue state. Savannah functions as his grounding mechanism, anchoring his awareness back to his child. The environment becomes static, thick with dangerous transference. Stripping away his authoritative title, he begs her to use his given name. Savannah immediately initiates physical distancing, recognizing the threat of a trauma bond. The psychological lesson is critical. Never compromise your established boundaries, regardless of how aggressively a fractured psyche attempts to merge with yours. Meanwhile, surveillance is constant. 2 floors down. His partner Camila monitors this exact interaction through a covert video feed, allowing paranoid ideation and severe jealousy to completely degrade her cognitive stability. Camila sits in an unlit space, a perfect reflection of her cognitive decay. She has financed a covert surveillance network to feed her paranoid delusions. Illuminated by the monitor, she exhibits obsessive repetition. Rewinding the footage 3 times, she watches the subject ask the employee to use his given name, identifying the raw attachment in his micro-expressions. It is a vulnerability supposedly buried with his deceased spouse. Yet, Camila displays complete emotional blunting, shedding no tears. The clinical takeaway is absolute. The moment surveillance becomes a prerequisite for relational security, the attachment is already necrotic. Paranoia offers no genuine defense mechanism. It merely calcifies the empathy centers, birthing a hypervigilant entity obsessed with maintaining total control. Stick with me. This is where the pathology deepens. Camila suppresses her depressive symptoms, allowing malignant narcissism to direct her actions. She calculates the threat matrix perfectly. If she inflicts physical trauma on Savannah, the Kingpin's retaliation will be catastrophic. Thus, she pivots to psychological warfare, engineering a scenario to trigger the victim's flight response. She wires $3,000 to a subordinate in debt, manipulating the network to ensure this operative intercepts the target. It is a textbook demonstration of psychopathic organization. The behavioral lesson is grim. Unchecked pathological envy will inevitably morph you into the predator you despise. Annihilating an innocent person to stabilize your fragile ego guarantees your own absolute ruin. Anna enters the vehicle, oblivious that she has stepped into a contained threat zone. Consulting her device, an acute physiological stress response activates. They have deviated drastically from the route. She issues a command to halt, but the operative maintains a catatonic forward gaze. The vehicle abruptly maneuvers into an unlit alley, the locks engaging audibly. Yet the subject displays remarkable emotional regulation, suppressing her vocal panic. She tactically positions her keys between her fingers. The clinical directive here is paramount. You must actively modulate your nervous system in crisis scenarios, never allowing paralyzing panic to override your basic survival instincts. Before the assault commences, a heavy sedan violently breaches the perimeter, flooding the grim alleyway with blinding illumination. Before the hostile operative can retreat, a secondary unit eliminates the escape route. The Kingpin surveillance network had been tracking her coordinates. 2 enforcers fracture the driver's window with blunt force trauma. A lieutenant extracts Savannah, placing a thermal layer over her to counteract clinical shock. Within 12 minutes, Dominic arrives, immediately relocating her into his secure transport. Note the absence of verbal inquiry regarding her physical state. His hypervigilant visual assessment has already scanned her physiology for trauma indicators. The psychological axiom is evident. Genuine protective figures do not rely on excessive verbalization. They simply deploy swift, calculated behavioral interventions when their subject's core security is threatened. The engine dominates the enclosed cabin. The ambient silence is pressurized until Dominic initiates a clinical interrogation. He applies direct psychological pressure, demanding the identity of the ambush architect. Savannah exhibits cognitive hesitation, reluctant to condemn a peer based on micro-expressions. Eventually, she vocalizes Camila's identity. When he asks why she withheld this critical intelligence, her response reveals a profound cognitive schema. She states she lacked the hierarchical authority to accuse his partner, refusing to force an ultimatum. This total absence of manipulative pathology is precisely the catalyst for his rapid attachment, in a behavioral landscape defined by pure sociopathy. Her rigorous ethical framework acts as a deeply magnetic anomaly. I have seen this defense mechanism. Dominic parks the vehicle, delivering a critical admission. He confirms a complete absence of romantic attachment toward Camila, categorizing her as a superficial tool utilized to avoid processing his grief. Savannah questions the clinical logic of introducing a synthetic caregiver to a traumatized child. Remorse floods his nervous system. He operated on the flawed hypothesis that any maternal archetype would suffice, ignoring the necessity of authentic attunement. The takeaway is absolute. You cannot suture a severe psychological laceration by substituting genuine connection with superficial convenience. Activating extreme defensive protocols, he secures her in a fortified suite. The violent restructuring of his syndicate has commenced. Savannah processes her displacement. Dominic enters his domicile. Camila remains unconscious, unaware of the shift in her relational status. He terminates her sleep cycle with a tone devoid of all effective resonance, mandating her immediate geographical relocation. Notice the absence of emotional dysregulation. There is no verbal escalation. He merely deposits a financial severance and a transit document onto the bed. He concedes a lack of empirical evidence, relying entirely on his calibrated threat detection. The behavioral protocol here is vital. Validate your subconscious threat assessments. When a subject's behavioral matrix indicates severe toxicity, a verbal confession is clinically irrelevant. Say psychological attachment unconditionally and permanently seal your perimeter. Observe the subject as her persona disintegrates. Camila experiences an acute narcissistic injury, replacing her innocent affect with unregulated hostility. She exhibits verbal escalation, deeply insulted by her replacement status. Succumbing to explosive rage, she launches a glass projectile at his cranium. It shatters violently, yet Dominic displays zero startle response. His nervous system remains completely flat. She executes a dramatic exit. However, observe the clinical premeditation. She bypasses the airport, entering a secondary vehicle and activating an unregistered device. The psychiatric rule of thumb is undeniable here. A subject's authentic pathology is only revealed when they are denied their desired outcome. To diagnose a dangerous personality, merely observe their behavioral response to absolute rejection. Open this clinical case file together. The voice on that disposable phone belongs to Victor Bermerick, a textbook malignant narcissist operating entirely from the shadows. His antisocial personality flourished in the Bronx, allowing him to build a massive weapons cartel devoid of basic human empathy. 2 years prior, this megalomaniac wired $28,000 to a sniper to eliminate his rival, Dominic. That bullet missed, tearing through Dominic's wife. Instead, collateral damage Victor simply rationalized away. We must observe a fundamental psychological reality here. Your most lethal threats rarely present with loud, aggressive posturing. The true danger always lies in the quiet, calculating sociopath who patiently observes your every move from the dark, entirely unseen. We are observing the physical manifestation of profound psychological trauma. The smoldering ruins of Victor's warehouses represent a grief that has mutated into irreversible madness. When that stray bullet claimed the life of Dominic's wife, his acute stress response fractured into a localized psychosis of vengeance. In a mere 9 days, he incinerated $11 million and buried 2 enforcers. Unable to secure empirical proof, the syndicates fell into a paralyzing Cold War. To break the stalemate, Victor deployed a severe manipulation, weaponizing his own niece Camila by sending her into Dominic's inner sanctum. We must understand that revenge is a pathological obsession. It consumes the host entirely, leaving you isolated in an ash-covered wasteland with absolutely nothing. You and I are now examining the absolute tipping point of moral decay. Inside a damp, smoke-filled basement, Camila cowers in a filthy corner, displaying the physical tremors of someone trapped by a narcissistic abuser for 8 months. She failed her assignment to locate Dominic's hidden child. Faced with Victor's zero-empathy stare, her survival instinct overrides all ethical boundaries. In a desperate act of self-preservation, she weaponizes a vulnerability Dominic's psychological attachment to an unassuming housekeeper named Savannah. It is a calculated betrayal of an entirely innocent bystander. Never invest your trust in an individual whose survival mechanism relies on sacrificing the innocent. Given the same psychological pressure, they will eagerly discard you without a thought. With trembling hands, the informant pushes the structural blueprints across a rusted table. Camila purges her intelligence, clinically detailing Dominic's trauma-bonded fixation on Savannah. She notes his gaze mirrors the unresolved grief he harbored for his deceased wife. We can observe Victor's predatory cognitions accelerating in the jagged shadows. He rapidly constructs a psychological trap, intending to abduct both the woman and the child. Knowing Dominic's savior complex will compel him to surrender completely, Victor then subjects Camila to cruel mockery, feeding his own grandiosity by exploiting her misplaced jealousy. Chronic envy is a destructive cognitive distortion. It narrows your peripheral vision, leaving your own psychological framework entirely exposed to catastrophic ruin. High in the penthouse, the architecture of Dominic's false security completely collapses. His enforcer, Frankie, presents empirical evidence of the infiltration, having extracted 3 sophisticated listening devices from the walls. The access logs confirm a severe breach. Camila is not merely an operative. She shares the narcissist's genetics. Dominic's reaction is explosive. He drives his fist into the mahogany desk with enough force to shatter glass. A physical release of intense cognitive dissonance. The psychological horror of realizing the predator was nested inside his sanctuary is profoundly destabilizing. You must rigorously analyze the individuals you allow into your inner environment. The most devastating psychological wounds are invariably inflicted by those closest to you. This catastrophic breach induces a severe physiological reaction in Dominic. His jaw locks as the terrifying reality sets in. He permitted a hostile agent proximity to his vulnerable child for 8 months. The sudden adrenaline surge causes him to hurl a chair into the drywall, immediately demanding a tripled security perimeter around Savannah. He requires her immediate relocation to a fortified environment. Meanwhile, 38 floors beneath this clinical paranoia, Savannah sits bathed in warm lamplight, entirely disconnected from the threat matrix. She is folding a paper bird, her mind resting in a state of dangerous equilibrium. Willful ignorance may temporarily lower your cortisol levels, but denying the reality of your environment is a fatal error when predators are circling. Let us break down this situational irony together, shall we? Savannah sits in a state of therapeutic calm, channeling her empathy into a paper pigeon to help the traumatized child communicate. She places the figure on her nightstand, displaying a severe lack of situational awareness regarding the escalating violence outside. She is completely blind to the sociopathic hit squad, navigating the rain-slicked streets, or the ominous vehicle idling near her exit. She is an empathetic anomaly trapped in a systemic cycle of generational violence. We must recognize that moral purity offers absolutely no psychological or physical protection against external malice. You must aggressively monitor your boundaries, because systemic destruction is entirely indifferent to your personal innocence. Operating on sheer survival instinct, Dominic bypasses all social conditioning. At precisely 7 a.m, he forces her door, dropping a classified dossier directly into her lap. The harsh impact of the evidence shatters her cognitive equilibrium. He ruthlessly dismantles her reality, explaining that Camila is an agent of the syndicate that assassinated his wife, and Savannah is now a high-value target simply by association. Adopting an authoritarian posture, he mandates her immediate relocation to a subterranean facility. When she attempts to rationalize her employment, he terminates the debate with a forced leave. Life will occasionally subject you to violent paradigm shifts that completely uproot your routine. You must adapt to these disruptions to ensure your own survival. Anna processes this extreme trauma with a remarkably stable affect. Her coping mechanism dictates one final request: retrieving a tin box containing the psychological anchors of her deceased brother. Dominic, overwhelmed by a pathological fear of repeating his past failure, refuses to delegate her protection to his subordinates. By early evening, their reinforced vehicle idles in the misting rain on an abandoned street. She emerges gripping a faded canvas bag, salvaging only a worn notebook and a cloth rabbit, objects of profound emotional resonance. In moments of severe psychological destabilization, maintaining a connection to your foundational memories is critical. The objects that tether your identity will always outweigh the hollow pursuit of material accumulation. Observe closely, because this is the exact moment the environmental tension fractures. Savannah steps onto the pavement just as 2 dark sedans execute a synchronized tactical block. The serene street instantly devolves into a theater of violence. 4 masked operatives deploy with raised weapons, utilizing shock and awe to disorient their targets. As gunfire shatters the auditory baseline, civilians experience acute panic responses, diving for cover. Dominic's central nervous system bypasses conscious thought entirely. His intense vigilance takes over, as he aggressively pulls Savannah behind the reinforced engine block. Those possessing true psychological resilience do not succumb to paralysis during a crisis. They instinctively absorb the risk to shield those incapable of defending themselves. The primary threat, however, operates from an elevated, unseen vantage point. 4 stories above the sensory overload, a concealed marksman tracks their erratic movements. Dominic's heightened threat perception registers a microscopic flash of light. In a textbook display of trauma-induced protective instinct, he intentionally intercepts the projectile's trajectory, sacrificing his own physical integrity to preserve Savannah's. The kinetic force of the round obliterates his defense, collapsing him onto the wet asphalt. Savannah's cognitive processing lags behind the trauma until the massive weight of her protector crashes into her hands. Genuine psychological attachment is never validated through superficial charm. It is proven by the definitive sacrifices made when the environment turns lethal. The atmospheric pressure inside the extraction vehicle is saturated with acute hysteria. Savannah vocalizes her trauma in a primal scream, while Frankie eliminates the final immediate threat. They drag Dominic's failing body into the cabin, accelerating dangerously toward an underground surgical facility. Savannah applies desperate pressure to his catastrophic wound, her hands coated in arterial blood. Experiencing a profound trauma bond, she tearfully demands to know why a man of his status would sacrifice himself for an invisible employee. Hovering on the edge of consciousness, he clarifies her altered value in his psychological hierarchy. Society's artificial labels cannot quantify your actual worth. Your true value is determined entirely by the permanent emotional imprint you leave on others. I are going to unpack this case file together, starting with a profound trauma response. Savannah begs Dominic to hold on to life, her tears masking the early onset of severe trauma. Bonding the Dawn, a textbook megalomaniac, narcissist, shows a rare tremor of humanity, whispering that his late wife offered those exact final words. Savannah fiercely demands he survive for his son, finally confessing her own desperate attachment before he loses consciousness. After 3 hours of brutal surgical intervention, Dominic stabilizes. Savannah remains isolated in the clinical corridor, garments stiffened by his blood, trapped in silent shock. We must recognize this simple lesson. The act of surviving violent trauma frequently inflicts the most permanent, invisible psychological scars. The clinical silence shatters under the heavy boots of Frankie, a subordinate operating within the syndicate. He drapes a coat over Savannah and reveals a crucial psychological pivot. 2 weeks prior, this apex predator stopped chasing phantoms and began desiring a tangible future. The catalyst for his behavioral shift was entirely her. This revelation completely dismantles Savannah's defensive psychological barriers. 18 grueling hours evaporate before Dominic finally regains awareness. He turns his head, finding her anchored in that rigid chair, still wearing his dried blood. She firmly rejected the primal urge to flee. The lesson here is fundamental. Those rare individuals who ground your psyche in absolute darkness are the only ones truly qualified to walk beside you in the light. The recovery room lacks warmth, dominated by the mechanical rhythm of monitors. Savannah suppresses her biological need for sleep, enduring 3 staff rotations in hypervigilant observation. Dominic analyzes the exhaustion in her eyes and selects absolute silence. Recognizing quiet as her optimal comfort at daybreak, he is moved to a sunlit suite. By midday, Frankie escorts the child Leo into the room. Savannah stands near the basin. Scrubbing dried blood from her skin, the boy bypasses her entirely, climbing the mattress to press his small hands against the violent father. This physical contact creates a stabilizing emotional gravity. The simple lesson is clear. Shared trauma often cements the most unbreakable familial bonds out of utterly shattered pieces. The child remains mute, but tears finally breach his emotional blockades. After 2 years, this traumatized boy allows his nervous system to release its buried grief. Dominic envelops him with his functioning arm, a rare nurturing gesture from a ruthless patriarch. True healing only begins when we abandon the exhausting facade of invulnerability. Savannah hesitates at the door, suffering from imposter syndrome in this intimate dynamic. But the kingpin deliberately signals her with a nod. The child looks at her and pushes against his father, non-verbally commanding the apex predator to yield territory. Dominic complies immediately. By stepping forward to join them, Savannah solidifies her integration into their deeply damaged familial ecosystem. Stick with me, because this behavioral interaction is critical. The child physically bridges the gap, forcing Savannah's anxious fingers against his father's hardened knuckles. Soon, the boy enters restorative sleep between them. When Savannah attempts to withdraw, Dominic's voice fractures the silence. Stripped of his narcissistic armor, he begs her to remain. The lesson is that genuine bravery means dropping our psychological shields, not enduring agony alone. Here, the Underworld kingpin exposes his jugular. He articulates his profound attachment while clinically detailing the lethal variables of his proximity. He offers an unrestricted exit strategy, swearing a binding oath to let her vanish into absolute safety, without a single act of retaliation. He guarantees funding for a fabricated identity. Savannah unearths a repressed trauma, admitting her brother perished because she broke vigilance for 4 minutes. This forged a pathological compulsion to never abandon loved ones. Yet, she fears she lacks the resilience for his violent ecosystem. Dominic locks onto her gaze, exhibiting megalomania by declaring he will force reality to bend. He intends to eradicate Merrick, transfer the syndicate to Frankie, and secure peace. Savannah counters with a statistical reality that cartel leaders rarely survive retirement. The vital lesson is that true freedom always mandates an exorbitant toll. Dominic coldly dismisses her rational panic, swearing to absorb whatever violent price is required to extract them both. Notice this behavioral shift. Savannah seizes control by interlacing her fingers with his damaged hand. Her brain is flooded with cortisol, yet her attachment overrides her instinct to evade the predator Merrick. She anchors herself for the child, and for her own psychological stability. A profound life lesson emerges. You cannot rescue a fractured psyche until you secure your own happiness. Dominic closes his eyes, his physiological tension dissipating as relief alters his nervous system. Outside the room, Frankie observes the bleeding kingpin, the sleeping child, and the woman fusing their unit. Having served multiple sociopathic leaders, Frankie recognizes this as a genuine familial bond. Any external interference now will undoubtedly trigger an apocalyptic, violent response. Shift your analysis across the city. Victor Merrick aggressively inspects building schematics while his enforcer watches, displaying the flat affect of a true psychopath. Merrick is enraged that Dominic survived. Does a predator abandon the hunt? Rarely. Consider this behavioral constant. When malicious actors cannot eliminate a primary target, they target vulnerable dependents. Merrick resolves to abduct the boy. 5 days elapse. Dominic is medically restrained with severe motor deficits, yet his dominant neurology remains stable. He retains the precise motor skills required to operate a firearm. For a violent narcissist fueled by paternal aggression, one functioning hand provides absolute lethal leverage. Anna and the boy are isolated in a fortified structure, masking heavy steel reinforcements. Frankie executes extreme risk mitigation, deploying 8 armed operatives on a strict surveillance rotation. It functions as an impenetrable vault. But acknowledge this critical behavioral lesson. Devastating systemic failures always begin internally. Misplaced trust is statistically deadlier than external violence. Merrick had been running a long-term manipulation strategy. He compromised Tony Russo, a low-ranking operative suffering severe financial distress from underground gambling. Acute psychological panic entirely eradicated Tony's syndicate allegiance. Through classic coercive control and unmanageable debt leverage, the rival sociopath now completely dictates this broken man's every move. Exploiting organizational chaos, Tony infiltrated the security detail undetected. Understand this clinical reminder: when panic governs a group, crucial survival protocols are ignored. During the night shift, Tony introduces a potent nervous system depressant into the guard's coffee. Soon, both internal operatives are rendered entirely unconscious. Tony sits paralyzed, experiencing severe cognitive dissonance while listening to the child's rhythmic breathing. Acute moral guilt fractures his psychological state. At exactly 3, his mobile device illuminates the dark, signaling the infiltration. The assassin Camila and 4 tactical operators breach the basement perimeter using duplicated access codes, sweeping silently over the hardwood to execute their surgical abduction. On the lower level, sentries are neutralized with chemical asphyxiants. 2 floors above, Savannah experiences an immediate physiological spike. She detects no auditory warning, only a shift of respiration in the hallway. Years of hypervigilance have permanently rewired her amygdala into a hypersensitive alarm system. Trauma is a brutal educator, yet it synthesizes the exact neurological armor required for survival. She propels herself from the bed, breaching the nursery. The child is conscious, exhibiting a catatonic P for rispus. She physically secures him, suppressing his vocalizations against her neck. As she calculates an escape vector, the artificial lighting abruptly engages. Camila occupies the doorway, firearm raised, blocking the exit with her armed mercenaries. Assassin views Savannah as a totally irrelevant civilian, yet her psychological fortitude holds. Savannah maneuvers the child behind her, using her body as a biological barrier, and clinically demands they take her instead. True resilience manifests when an individual willingly exchanges their mortality to preserve another. Camila laughs forcefully, extracting them into the night with sensory deprivation hoods. You and I must evaluate this concluding frame together. 20 minutes later, the traitor Tony hyperventilates on the floor. He processed the auditory stimuli of the child's terrified wail during transport. It perfectly replicated the pitch of his own nephew. This single traumatic sensory trigger completely obliterates the final fragments of his ruined psychological stability. Let us open the case file on Tony. Psychologically, self-preservation usually wins, yet throwing a child to the wolves breaks his cognitive baseline. It teaches us a simple truth: even cowards hide a spark of grace. Driven by an acute adrenaline spike, he wakes the guards, surrendering the enemy coordinates. Frankie receives the intel and calls Dominic at 5:18 in the morning to deliver the crushing blow. Dominic instantly undergoes a violent psychological fracture. He rips the intravenous tubes from his arm, Despite partial paralysis, he uses his teeth and right hand to strap on a holster. Frankie begs him to stay back, but the father is gone, replaced by a territorial apex predator. He snarls that they are his blood. Miles away, Savannah shivers on the freezing concrete, awaiting the collision. We observe Savannah on the freezing concrete, locked in a pure survival state. She wraps her arms around little Leo, humming to regulate his nervous system. The child shakes violently before a breakthrough occurs. A fragile breath escapes his lips to form a single syllable. Sav, he calls her name. We must remember that the family we choose often holds far more psychological weight than biology. Savannah weeps into his hair, just as the iron door grinds open. Camila enters the dim space, hiding behind antisocial posturing. Her pistol catches the shadows as she mocks them. But Savannah refuses the victim profile. She shields the boy and declares Camila is no megalomaniacal monster like Merrick, that she could never execute a child. In that silence, the assassin's cold hand actually begins to tremble. Look closely at this clinical progression. You and I, as the tragedy deepens, the silence shatters with the sharp crack of a rifle. Driven by the temporary psychosis of a desperate father, Dominic leads 12 loyal men into an absolute slaughterhouse. Their vehicles move like phantoms toward a fortress, swallowed by a decaying refinery. In the lead car, Tony grips the steering wheel, his nervous system in complete overdrive. Cold sweat drips down his neck as he prays for one righteous act before his demise. The headlights die at the boundary. Never underestimate the destructive capacity of a man whose behavioral inhibitors have been entirely burned away. Operating with cold precision, Dominic's crew breaches the outer perimeter in exactly 11 terrifying seconds. He shatters the loading bay doors, pouring inside with his enforcers like vengeful spirits. But we must analyze this cycle of violence clinically. It is never a clean fantasy. 2 of Dominic's soldiers are thrown against the concrete, their brain activity ceasing instantly. A wife is condemned to complex grief, and a little girl will now develop abandonment trauma. Frankie steps over the bodies, whispering their names into the smoke. It illustrates a devastating reality. Blind loyalty always exacts a terminal physical toll, and the streets never mourn the collateral damage. The defending guards unleash a relentless wall of lead, but Dominic is completely dissociated from the danger. With his arm bound to his chest, he methodically eliminates a guard with 3 calculated shots. Step into this corridor with me to observe a megalomaniacal narcissist in his final moments. Merrick waits in the shadows, displaying the flat effect of a dead man. He spits that he has waited years for this. Dominic's micro-expressions remain completely blank. He simply replies that Merrick stole his only son, meaning the psychological ledger is settled tonight. We must remember that vengeance is a bitter poison that always consumes both predator and prey. Merrick's grandiosity shatters entirely. His first erratic bullet tears past Dominic's ear. Dominic fires back with mechanical precision, dropping his rival. But, as his neurological functions fade, Merrick unleashes one last desperate round. The bullet slips beneath the armor plate, sending Dominic crashing against the damp brick wall. Watch as severe trauma drains the motor function from Dominic's legs. He fights off unconsciousness just long enough to see Frankie materialize behind Merrick. There is no narcissistic monologue here. Frankie simply raises his weapon and terminates the man responsible for so much generational trauma. Down the hall, the acoustic shockwave rattles the plaster. Camilla hears the violence and suffers an acute panic attack. Savannah recognizes the sheer terror, flooding the young woman's amygdala. Without hesitation, she throws her body into the line of fire to shield little Leo. True courage is not the absence of a fear response. It is the conscious willingness to bleed for the innocent, even when your own biological systems are begging you to flee. The weapon in Camila's hands vibrates with her unregulated anxiety. Savannah employs a brilliant de-escalation technique. She takes one deliberate step forward, projecting profound stability, and softly instructs the broken girl to drop the gun. Camila's defensive facade crumbles. She screams that she sold her morality to this syndicate and has no identity left. Savannah locks eyes with her, whispering that her heart still beats, and that alone is enough. This is a crucial psychological truth. No matter how deep of a behavioral pit you dig, your life regains its value the exact second you put down the shovel. The heavy tension breaks. Camila collapses to the floor in a state of cathartic weeping. Savannah quickly kicks the weapon away, scoops up the child, and flees into the dark. The door breaches with explosive force. Frankie scans the room, operating entirely on combat reflexes. Savannah screams for him to halt, pleading for the weeping girls. life we observe a profound cognitive dissonance on Frankie Dest's face. He pauses for one agonizing second to override his conditioning, then coldly cuffs Camilla. Savannah carries Leo down the stairwell, the air toxic with gunpowder. Then she spots Dominic. He is slumped against the brickwork, slipping into hemorrhagic shock. She drops to her knees, screaming his name to anchor his fading consciousness. He weakly begs to see his boy. She presses Leo to his chest, and the traumatized child whispers a single word, Dad. Genuine attachment is the absolute final anchor we possess when the abyss tries to pull us under. That stimulus was only the third time the boy ever spoke. The kingpin suffers a complete emotional collapse, burying his face in his son's hair, allowing pure catharsis to wash the blood away. Savannah weeps beside them. Even a conditioned enforcer like Frankie turns away to mask his emotional response. Sirens wail in the distance, their delay highly orchestrated. Frankie's crew dissolves like ghosts, leaving Merrick's narcissistic empire in ruins. What of Camilla? Frankie made a highly rational pivot, swapping an execution for a federal kidnapping charge. Learn this psychological truth: effective leaders do not need to endlessly shed blood to assert dominance. They simply rewrite the rules. She survives, but her next 30 years belong to an isolation cell. We transition to the clinical reality of a trauma ward. Dominic engages in a desperate biological fight, enduring 2 extensive surgeries over 14 days. A clandestine surgeon confesses she believed the boss was already deceased upon arrival. But patients with extreme behavioral drive often defy medical baselines. For 3 weeks, Dominic experiences suffocating neurological pain. His physical vessel is shattered. Yet, notice the environmental shift. Every morning, Savannah introduces a grounding ritual with fresh coffee. Every afternoon, his son leaves a paper bird as a token of secure attachment. It confirms a beautiful psychological fact. A secure family bond acts as a profound emotional buffer, providing the exact resilience required to outlast the darkest physical trauma. Because we are about to watch a textbook shift in group dynamics, Savannah deliberately uses his given name in front of the soldiers, establishing verbal dominance and ordering him to rest. Frankie masks a knowing smile. 10 days later, the real sociological test occurs in a claustrophobic room on Mulberry Street. 11 antisocial bosses gather around a table reeking of bleach, concealing weapons out of chronic paranoia. The tension is palpable. Dominic enters, his torso heavily bound, and permanently alters their behavioral structure. He locks eyes with these violent men and calmly announces his resignation. Remember this crucial life lesson. Recognizing the exact moment to step away from absolute power is the strongest psychological move any person can ever make. Dominic's clinical detachment is chilling as he transfers control to Frankie. A captain exhibits aggressive posturing, declaring death is the only permitted exit strategy in their pathology. Dominic counters that his strategic mind remains available, but his violent compulsions are retired. His child is the priority. Suddenly, a reactive lieutenant makes a fatal miscalculation, muttering a slur about Savannah. Overriding his severe pain receptors, Dominic slowly pushes himself to his feet. His physical presence completely dominates the room. He coldly mandates absolute respect for her, threatening immediate bodily harm to any dissenter. Hold on to this undeniable fact: a truly grounded man will happily dismantle his own violent empire to protect the partner who cured his psychological rot. Today, you and I are going to unpack the final psychological transition of this criminal syndicate. We observe Frankie elevating a glass of amber liquor, swearing an oath to uphold discipline boundaries. The sociopathic violence of the Vasari bloodline is officially suppressed. Later, in the sterile environment of a clinic, Savannah probes Dominic on his readiness to relinquish his empire. Dominic extends his bruised fingers to hers, vocalizing that the Mafia was an inherited generational trauma, a nightmare constructed by his father. Tonight he chooses cognitive liberation. The clinical takeaway is fundamental. You are never forced to swallow the toxic behavioral patterns your family pours for you. You alone possess the psychological agency to write your final chapter. The acute stress of their territorial warfare finally concludes. With his rival neutralized, Dominic assesses that Frankie possesses the raw grit to manage the bleeding streets. Savannah sits at his bedside, probing his desires for his remaining days. Dominic draws oxygen into his battered lungs, articulating a future that sharply contrasts his former megalomania. He wants to escort his son to the school gates and sleep, without the paranoid need to grip cold steel in the dark. We learn a critical lesson from his shifting psychological baseline. True wealth is never found in the ruthless subjugation of others. It is simply the grace to feel entirely safe inside your own home. Savannah releases a warm laugh, finally stepping into the light of cognitive recovery. You and I will examine this pivotal moment of behavioral rehabilitation. Dominic extends his scarred hand to cover hers, displaying a reduction in his emotional avoidance. He refuses to rush the fragile interaction. Desperate for a human anchor in his shifting psychological tide, they sit locked in profound silence for 20 consecutive minutes. Across the room, juvenile subject Leo remains in deep sleep. Clutching a paper rabbit, a self-soothing object Savannah constructed, the quiet gently breaks when Maggie, a nurse, delivers a warm foil bundle of homemade banana bread. A vital lesson breathes within this clinical observation. The smallest, most unexpected acts of human kindness are exactly what it takes to reconstruct a profoundly fragmented psyche. He lingers near the door, clinically observing the bruised former kingpin, the exhausted protector, and the sleeping juvenile. After 35 years analyzing human collateral in these corridors, she registers their bonded dynamic with a slow, knowing nod. They have formed a non-traditional familial unit. 6 weeks later, Dominic is discharged. He actively rejects the narcissistic isolation of his Manhattan penthouse. Instead, they relocate to a weathered, 3-story brownstone, secured with meticulously clean documentation to erase his digital footprint. This provides a measurable truth for our files. You can absolutely rewrite your destiny, but only if you are willing to trade the hollow illusion of power for the unshakable foundation of lasting psychological peace. In a typical profile, one expects a former crime boss to seek defensive grandiosity, yet Dominic selects an ordinary environment defined by crooked tiles and a creaking porch. Savannah initiates a definitive boundary maneuver, flatly refusing to cohabitate. She secures a cramped apartment above a flower shop, paying in cash and pressing her name onto the doorbell. Maintaining unbroken eye contact, she informs the former Don she will operate autonomously, rather than accept his gilded provisions. Dominic nods, his physiological stress yielding to profound respect. The analytical takeaway is strictly empirical. You must never let another person hold the keys to your personal independence, regardless of your deep emotional attachment to them. Dominic's threat protocols prevent him from cornering a woman reconstructing her identity. Savannah maintains a hyper-vigilant work ethic, scrubbing floors to finance her autonomy, while she monitors the juvenile, Leo. Dominic drafts meticulous legal documentation ensuring formal health coverage. Within this structured sanctuary, Leo's trauma responses diminish. He articulates clear sentences and constructs paper rabbits, a textbook coping mechanism of a pediatric survivor. Yet, Dominic's ingrained narcissism temporarily resurfaces when he presents brochures for heavily fortified elite academies. We must recognize the underlying clinical reality. Injecting vast quantities of capital into a traumatized family system will never generate authentic developmental progress. You and I will analyze this cognitive clash together. Savannah sweeps the glossy stimulus away, demanding Leo integrate with a normative public school population. Dominic's narcissistic injury is immediate as he asserts his capacity to buy into any elite circle. Savannah swiftly dismantles his grandiosity, dictating that the boy must develop resilience in the real world, rather than isolating inside a fragile socioeconomic bubble. The former Don experiences acute psychological humbling, silently signing the document. Savannah subsequently enrolls in night classes, financing her advancement with hard labor and heavy loans. The empirical lesson stands. True power is maintaining a grounded reality, while others engage in manic upward flight. Covering her tuition invoice triggers Dominic's conditioned provider complex. He demands to liquidate the balance. Savannah exhibits an ironclad locus of control. She asserts her need to achieve mastery through personal exertion, inflicting a psychological strike by noting his lifelong insulation from legitimate economic struggle. This diagnostic truth shatters his defenses, inducing total verbal suppression. Later, Savannah prepares a familial recipe, intentionally burning the edges to flood the environment with positive sensory anchors. Leo consumes the meal, his pupil dilation indicating pure joy. The clinical data confirms a profound human truth. The absolute best psychological anchors in life are those constructed meticulously from scratch, with your own scarred hands. Nick extracts a cork from an aged vintage, analyzing the substance as a hostile agent. Exhibiting elevated impulse control, he substitutes the depressant with juice. 7 weeks of sobriety fundamentally rewires his neural pathways later. Juvenile Leo transitions into sleep across Savannah's lap, gripping a paper mechanism. Dominic finally dismantles his affective armor. He verbalizes an acute phobia of proposing, theorizing she might only accept due to a trauma bond or obligation. Savannah adjusts her posture, whispering that no emotional debt exists. Her attachment is entirely authentic. The clinical assessment is definitive. True loyalty is never about maintaining a transactional ledger. It is about remaining emotionally present when a person reaches peak vulnerability. Stick with me, as we must shift our clinical focus. The primary subjects initiate authentic intimacy, a careful merging of two traumatized entities rejecting their bleak statistical outcomes. We cross-reference this with subject Camila, isolated within a maximum security facility. Stripped of her narcissistic supply, she exhibits severe physiological distress. Hunched over a metallic desk, she drafts a desperate correspondence to her maternal figure. Her psychological facade has ruptured. She confesses her cognitive distortion, acknowledging that a parasitic existence never justified severing familial attachments. The behavioral consequence is absolute. Sometimes, an individual must endure total environmental deprivation to finally recognize their core emotional imperatives. Camila conceals the document for 6 months before overriding her avoidance behaviors to dispatch it. Confronting internalized psychopathy requires immense cognitive expenditure. In this file, the primary variable is not violence. It is the empirical discovery that prosocial behavior cannot be acquired through illicit capital. A simple paper construction successfully rehabilitates traumas that infinite financial resources cannot mitigate. Identifying a partner who maintains proximity during severe panic episodes is statistically rare. The genuine apex figures of society do not utilize intimidation. They operate in marginalized sectors and endure chronic fatigue. We must elevate these resilient individuals, for their unrecorded emotional labor is the sole adhesive, preventing total societal collapse. You and I have concluded our evaluation. These unrecognized subjects occupy clinical environments, fabricating paper toys for traumatized juveniles. Observe your immediate social proximity today. Identify the person who provides stabilizing anchoring without demanding transactional compensation. Acknowledge their psychological endurance. If the empirical weight of this analysis resonated with you, drop a like, distribute this file to your associates, and subscribe for continuous psychological dissections. Document your stabilizing entity. In the comments, your data may dictate our next study. Rigorously defend your neurological baseline, and continuously inject unregulated empathy into hostile environments. You cannot calculate the exact psychological collapse you might be preventing.
Dominic's journey is not only about love, it is also about change. He inherits a violent world from his father and spends years trying to control damage without fully escaping the life that created it. He removes the darkest parts of the family business, but he still lives surrounded by danger, revenge, and fear. After Elena's death, grief becomes the center of his existence. Savannah and Leo give him a reason to imagine something different. This does not erase his past. It does not make his choices simple. But it does force him to ask a deeper question. Does he want to keep surviving as a feared man, or does he want to live as a father? The educational lesson here is that redemption is not a feeling. It is a decision followed by action. Dominic does not simply say he wants a normal life. He steps back from power. He hands responsibility to Frankie. He chooses a smaller home, a quieter future, and a life centered on Leo's healing instead of revenge. This is meaningful because many people remain trapped in roles they never truly chose. They inherit family expectations, harmful habits, emotional wounds, or dangerous patterns. Change becomes difficult because the old life feels familiar, even when it hurts them. Dominic's transformation teaches that a different future requires courage. It may mean giving up power, pride, or identity. It may mean admitting that the life you built is not the life you want your child to inherit. The story also reminds us that healing is not instant. Leo still needs support. Savannah still needs independence. Dominic still carries his past. But together, they begin building something healthier. The final lesson is hopeful. We are not required to remain what pain made us. With love, responsibility, and honest choices, even a broken life can move toward peace.